Please. Well, some have said that Genesis is probably the best book in the Bible for getting a good foundation, and it is. That's what the word means, is beginnings. And so if you have a good idea of what occurs in Genesis, you'll be able to use that information to help you throughout the Bible. It's foundational, no question about it. And today we're in Genesis chapter 14, and if you'll look there please, we're going to try to get through 16 verses today. And let's begin at Genesis 14. I'm going to read, and you follow please as we read from Genesis 14. Now, before I begin reading, it's always important that we know what the situation is before we start reading a passage of Scripture. You need to know the background. So let me give you a little bit of background, then I'll read verses 1 through 16 of Genesis. First of all, we need to understand when this occurred. What we're going to discuss today, it occurred about 400 years after the flood. So get in your mind the flood of Noah, and 400 years later, approximately, these things will occur. Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the three sons of Noah, have repopulated the earth, and the people have got together in nations. Now, not nations like we think of today, because there wasn't a big population. Dr. Henry Morris says it more like city-states, small groups of people. We'll call them nations because there's not a better word to describe them. But I want you to understand they're not like the United States. There are not a lot of people that's being involved in the story we'll discuss today. Abraham had been called of God to leave the Ur of the Chaldees and his pagan religion, and became a monotheist, became a believer in one God. And as he leaves the Ur of the Chaldees, he and his family all leave, and then finally it winds up with Abraham, his family, his servants, and Lot, his nephew that travels with him. Well, as they make their way to Canaan, they all become very prosperous. Abraham he was a businessman. He had sheep, he had cattle, all these things. He taught, I'm sure, Lot how to merchandise the cattle and the sheep and all these things. And so pretty soon they both became very, very successful and very prosperous, both Abraham and Lot. Well, this created a problem, because they had the prosperity, but their workers could not get along with each other. The Bible calls them herdmen, and they were fighting with each other, and so something had to be done. They decided they would split up, and so Abraham, being the noble man that he was, gave his nephew Lot the choice of where he would go. And we've studied that, of course, the past few weeks. And Lot chose to go toward Sodom and Gomorrah, which was a plain area, beautiful valleys and water abundant and everything. It sure looked good to him. So he chose that, while Abram stayed around Hebron, that area, around north of Jerusalem, basically, is where we're talking about. And so when we come to the story today, what we are going to look at is that Abraham is in his location, Lot is in Sodom and Gomorrah, which is basically down by the Dead Sea. It was called the Salt Sea at one time. And so that's the circumstances that sets up the reading for today. So follow as I read very quickly from Genesis 14 and verse 1. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, then Tidal, king of nations. I'll talk about these in just a moment. That these made war with the Bera, the king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah. Aren't you glad I'm getting to read this? Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. All these were joined together in the vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. And in the 14th year came Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaims in Ashtaroth, Karnaim, and the Zuzims in Ham, and the Emims in Shaveh, Kerathaim, and the Horites in the Mount of Seir, unto El Paran, which is by the wilderness. And they returned and came to En Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites, and also of the Amorites that dwelt in Hazon Tamar. And there went out the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, the same as Zoar. That's the ones already mentioned in verses 1 and 2. And they joined battle with them in the valley of Siddim. Now I'll explain all this in a moment so we all are on the same page. With Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, and with Tidal, king of nations, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Ariah, king of Elasar, 4 kings with 5. Now that's what we're going to study today, is the battle between the 4 kings and 5. 9 nations involved, and I'll explain that in more detail, but that gives you a good verse to understand how many is involved in this war that's going on. And the vale of Siddim was full of slime pits, and the king of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, and there that remained fled to the mountain. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their victuals, and went their way. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And there came one that had escaped, and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. And when Abram heard that his brother, now understand that's not his literal brother, but his brother's son, his brother in the faith, you might say, was taken captive, that would be Lot, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. And he divided himself against them, he and his servants, by night, and smote them and pursued them into Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot, and his goods, and the women also, and the people. Now, when I first read this chapter, I thought I would skim it very quickly and not even go into much detail on it, because it's a little difficult to try to understand why the Holy Spirit put this in here. But the more I studied it, the more valuable I saw that it really was. And so today we're going to begin. We don't have an outline. Matter of fact, our projector has gone out. We got to buy a new one. I'm going to be taking up an offering for that this morning. I don't know what it's going to cost. I'll have to ask Scott. You or Jody might know what a new projector will cost us, but we got to get one. This one over Ron's head back there, it shows back there, it's working fine, but this one has gone out. So we can't show outlines or anything, maps or anything like that on the overhead, because it's gone out on us. But we need to buy a new one. But I'm going to give you the outline today. If you want to follow an outline, if you don't, that's okay too. Now, the outline that I'm giving you has to do, first of all, with the conditions of war in verses 1 and 2. And I think it's a good time right now for us to look at your maps, if you would please. And your map, have you got another one of them? Yep. You got 2 of them there. I left my original back there. This map, I think, will help you understand a little bit what we're talking about, the area that we're talking about. And so look at your maps, please. What you've got here is you've got Elam. I've circled that. I've written in Shinar. These are ancient names. And I've encircled, over on your left-hand side, I've encircled Jerusalem. And there at Jerusalem, just a little bit south of Jerusalem, is the Dead Sea. Now, what I'm teaching you is this. The ones I've got circled over here on the right are the ones on the east. They are the 4 kings that's going to come over to the west, where Jerusalem and Jordan is, in that area, that's the 5 kings on the right, 4 kings on the left. Does that all make sense to you? They're going to enjoin a battle here. These 4 kings against 5 is what this battle is normally called. But it's a battle between modern day Iran. If you'll notice, please, there next to Elam, you have written in there Iran. That's ancient Persia. So the map you have is showing the Bible times of old and today. So you've got Iran, and if you'll notice, please, Babylonia. The word Babylonia on the left side of it is Iraq. That's modern day. So modern day Iran and modern day Iraq are the countries that we're talking about. The thing that's interesting about this is you have potentially the same thing going on at this very day. You have the forces of Iran with Ahmadinejad threatening Israel over there on the left of side of your map. And so it's kind of deja vu. It's sort of what goes around comes around. This battle we're talking about today occurred 5,000 years ago, and here we are again today with Iran threatening Israel. Isn't that interesting that it's all kind of come full circle? And so this will give you some idea. Ancient Babylonia is modern day Iraq. Ancient Persia is modern day Iran. And of course, Israel until 1948 was not a nation, but today it is. And of course, you know all of the things that's currently going on in Israel. So I hope this map gives you some idea of the area that we're talking about today. The 4 kings on the east are going to come over to Israel and fight this battle against Abram. Any questions now about this? Yeah.
What was Israel before 1948?
Israel was not a nation. After 70 A.D., when Titus destroyed Jerusalem, it ceased to be a nation until 1948. The people were actually assimilated into the other nations.
Who governed it?
Well, it was called Palestine, and for a while the Turks governed it, and then the English had it for a while, and so the Ottoman Empire, you've heard of that. That's basically a Turkish empire. It was ruled by the Muslims, and that set up the stage for the Crusades. When the Europeans, basically Catholics, come over to Jerusalem, who was in the hands of the Muslims that led the Crusades. I don't know if you've ever studied all this or not, but basically, bottom line is from 70 AD to 1948, there were Jews living in Israel. They were living there, but they did not have a nation. Matter of fact, there were Jews also living in Iraq. There were Jews living in Iran. There were Jews living in different in Egypt to the south. They were scattered all over because that was a dispersion in 70 A.D. when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and they were scattered out. So there was no nation.
Okay.
Different nations ruled.
They weren't part of a country then?
No. They called it Palestine. But as far as them having their own identity as a nation, no. That from 70 AD to 1948, they did not. Now the interesting thing is, all during that time from 70 AD to 1948, there were Jews in the Jerusalem area that lived there. So Jews have been there since Abraham. See, that's the argument today. Well, who does the land belong to? Does it belong to the Palestinians? They were there first. No, the Canaanites were there first. And Abram comes in and runs the and takes over the Canaanites, and eventually you have Moses and Joshua and whatever, and setting up the kingdom of Israel. But it's Israel's land. It was promised to them, but it's been in different hands now for many, many years. Does that help you any at all to understand?
Sort of, yeah.
Okay. Ron, you might want to add to that. Anything you want to add to that? Because he studied this too as well.
Israel basically has never been a nation as such.
Right.
until 48.
Right.
Because all back there, it was the Amorites, Amalekites, all these people
Right.
that you mentioned
Right.
were different localities.
Right. Until Saul.
Right.
Because then you have Saul, David, and Solomon. It was a nation at that time.
But still had the other people.
Had the other people, right. They were told to destroy those other people and didn't do it.
Didn't do it. So
Yeah.
they were never really set up as a nation
Right.
themselves,
Yeah.
controlling the whole thing.
Separate.
Right.
Yeah. They were intermingled.
They were mingled, they're still mingled today, but now they are accepted as a nation.
Right, right.
Which hasn't been.
In what we would say the classical sense. But for all those years, they haven't, they've had all these other tribes in there, and there's been, but in the classical sense, 1948 was what you're saying is when they became a nation.
Even up to 70 AD, the Romans had control.
Right.
So they weren't really.
Right, right. So that gives you some idea of what we're talking about. We're talking about this battle we're going to look at, 5 kings against 4. Remember now, Abram's going to win this battle. But let's understand the wars going on. Now, this is the first, there's 3 first mentions in chapter 14 of the book of Genesis. The first mention is this is the first time war is mentioned in the Bible. Did you know that? Genesis 14. I think it's verse 2? First time you find the word war mentioned in the Bible. Were there wars preceding this? We don't know. This is the first recorded instance of war in the Bible. You say, well, preacher, what about in the times of Noah? Don't you imagine that they had wars back there? Because from the time of Adam to the time of the flood was 1,600 years. Don't you imagine there was wars? I don't know. There's no record of it. All we know is they were married and given in marriage and whatever. It seems like it could have been that the antediluvian people before the flood could be that they didn't have wars. Of course, you have Cain killing Abel, which is certainly the seed of war, but you don't have it recorded. This is the first time you have it recorded. The second thing you have recorded in the book of Genesis, this is just in chapter 14, we'll get to this, is you have the first mention of Hebrew. It says Abram was a Hebrew. So you don't have that before in the first 13 chapters of Genesis. This is the first time you see the word Hebrew mentioned. And then when you get to one of the other verses, you see the numbers 12 and 13, which will be the first time they are mentioned in the Bible. So, with that kind of a background, let me try to explain this to you the best that I can. We're looking at the conditions of war. Let's notice first the participants in this war. If you look, please, at verse 1, you've got Shinar, Amphil, king of Shinar, that's modern-day Iraq. Arioch, king of Eleazar. Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, that's modern-day Iran. Tidal, king of nations. Now, basically, those are the nations that's going to war against the nations in verse 2. They made war with Bera, the king of Sodom, with Birsha, the king of Gomorrah, and then those other mentioned. So it comes down to 5 nations are going to attack 4 nations. The place of the battle, that's the participants. You might even say this. You've got the kings of the east. Think of it this way. Look up here. This is east. This is Chedorlaomer, by the way, evidently is the leader of these nations. These kings of the east are going to come across the map there that you're looking at, across Babylonia and down to Canaan, and they're going to attack Abram, they're going to attack Lot rather, and Sodom and Gomorrah and those 5 nations. Are y'all still with me here? So we understand. 4 nations of the east are going to attack 4 nations of the west. That's what the battle is talking about. Notice the place of this battle is in verse 3. The participants in verse 1 and 2, there's 9 of them total. Verse 3 says, and these were joined together in the vale of Siddim, which is the salt sea. So, look up here at me again. 4 kings of the east are coming to do battle and overthrow the 5 nations or 5 kings of the west. And the battle is going to be fought around the Salt Sea, which is the Dead Sea. So look on your map, please. They're going to start over here, and they're going to come over here to Jerusalem and to the Dead Sea in particular, and these 4 kings are going to fight these 5 kings right over here in the Vale of Siddim. Now the vale means a valley, so this battle is going to take place. The 4 kings of the east are going to come and fight against the 5 kings of the west. If that helps you to understand this. King Chedorlaomer is the leader of these 4 kings that come out of Iran, Iraq, over to Israel. That's the place of the battle. It's around the Dead Sea. It's a flat area, and it's a plain area that they're going to fight, even though there's a valley there and there are some slime pits there that we'll get to in a moment. Now, the problem we see revealed to us is in verse 4. And Tim, if you got any water back there in your room, or a cup of water would be great. We've looked at the participants of this battle and the place of the battle. It's around the Dead Sea. Now, the problem, what is it that causes this battle? It's found in verse 4. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. Now the question is, who are they? Would anybody want to tell me who they are? I know it's early in the morning, and I know this is hard to understand. Well, let me tell you who they are. They are the 5 nations of the west with their 5 kings. They've been serving the 4 nations and Chedorlaomer for 12 years. But there's a problem that arises. They get tired of being under the tribute of these 4 kings of the east. Y'all still with me? These kings of the east are coming over to the west, and they've been under tribute now, under them, the kings of Iraq and Iran, for 12 long years. But they've had enough. They don't want to be under their authority anymore. They want to be independent of their authority. And the 4 kings of the east are coming over to make sure that they don't get away from them. They want to keep their hand on Sodom and Gomorrah and upon these nations that are in the west. Any questions up to now? That's the problem that is revealed to us. That's the why of this battle. These 4 kings of the east don't want to let the 5 nations of the west get out from under their thumb. Okay? That's why they're coming over there. They're going to come over to humble them and show them that they're stronger than the 5 kings of the west, and this creates the problem. Now, it's interesting that you have the number 12 and 13 in verse 4. Notice verse 4 again. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer. The number 12 is the number of government. You have the 12 tribes of Israel. You have the 12 apostles who will judge. The Bible talks about Israel. So it's the number of government, and you have 13, the 13th year. You see, the Holy Spirit put these numbers in there for a purpose. They want us to understand this. Now, Ron, you go ahead. You probably got some comments on that very thing. Go ahead.
No, not on that. We have the same situation today. Iran and Iraq are trying to take Israel back because they were in rebellion. They believe that should belong to them.
Isn't that amazing? That it's just as relevant to see, human nature is not changed, and God here 5,000 years later, you have the same thing developing. They don't want to let Israel become independent, and Israel's fighting for their lives. I mean, right now, if you're watching the news at all, and isn't it interesting that little old Israel's in the news right now more than any other place in the world? Is that by accident? No, I think that's by design, and I think God's telling us He's getting ready to do something. Yeah, go ahead.
Abraham today will be God. Right.
Good point. Yeah, as Abraham delivered the 5 kings of the east, we'll find out at the end of this story, he typifies, Brother Ron mentions, typifies Israel that will be delivered by Christ when He comes back at the end of the tribulation period to overthrow all the governments of the world. But the number 13, let me mention something about it before going further. Notice there's 12 years they serve him. That's government. 13th year, I had my wife look this up on the computer, and she come up with, I told her, Dr. Morris says that the number 13 is the number of rebellion and apostasy. And so I had her look that up, and that's what she got too, was the 13th year, they rebelled. The 5 kings rebels against the authority of the 4 kings. Now still, I hope you're with me here. 4 kings are coming over of the east, coming over to the west to make sure these 5 kings and these nations don't get out from under their thumb. So these 5 kings rebel against them, so that causes the war. Okay? Now, I looked up the number 13 in the Bible, and there's not a whole lot of information that I can see that's real relevant. I think he's got a point, Dr. Morris does, but it's hard to prove it, that's very obvious. The number 13, we all know, is an unlucky number, don't we? But I can't pick a particular incident in the Bible where there was apostasy and where there was rebellion, and the number 13 actually stands out. I just could not find that. And the man that Janie was looking at on the computer, he couldn't find, a roundabout way, but it was very ambiguous. It certainly wasn't enough proof. If you can't prove it, I don't like to give, theories on things if it can't be proven. And I know that, there were 13 apostles, and the tribes of Israel, of course, some of them were left out and some were added. You could go into all of that, but there's nothing clear-cut that says number 13 is the number of rebellion and apostasy, other than alluding to it here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you basically covered what I was going to say. I think I talked to you about this before. 10 beasts, 10 horns.
Right.
It's completeness. 10 is completeness.
Right.
Then the Antichrist comes in and makes 11.
Right. Little horn.
The false prophet is a 12.
Right.
But with the ones you mentioned, Israel, 12 apostles, and they had 13. One committed suicide. Then you have the 13 was the Antichrist, I believe, made up the unlucky or the depravity and rebellion. Yeah.
It's alluded to, but not clear cut, that's all I'm saying. But you do have associated with rebellion right here. And I just want to share that with you, that it seems to be. I think it's interesting that we're coming up to 2013, don't you? Pretty soon here. Will there be some kind of rebellion take place in 2013? Will there be apostasy take place in Christendom? And I think it's already started to take place. But will it begin at a greater scale in 2013? Again, what goes around comes around. There might be some kind of association here we're talking about.
The preacher yesterday said that we elected depravity and rebellion this year.
Well, no question about it. You can't get around it. That's, that's what's happening. And you reap what you sow. And so we'll probably reap what we sow. Now we look at verses 5 through 7. I'm not going to take a lot of time with it other than just tell you this. Everybody look up here at me, because I want you to see this. As these four kings of Iran and Iraq, modern day, are Shinar and Elam in the days of Abraham. Now look up here, I want you to see this. As they make their way over here to Israel, they come in contact with several other small groups. We can't hardly call them nations, though they are named like nations, but they're different groups. Now, they're mentioned in verses 5 through 7. If you'll notice, please, and in the 14th year came Chedorlaomer, the kings with him, that's 4 kings, and smote the Rephaims, the Zamzims, the Emims, the Amalekites, the Amorites. All of these nations were between Iran and Israel. Okay? Now, let me just say this about these nations. They all seem to be occultic. They all seem to be, matter of fact, the Rephaims and the Zamzims and the Emims were all giants. You find that in other places in the Bible. So between, when they come over to do battle here, they're going to do battle with these giants. But these 4 kings are going to overthrow them on their way to Israel. See, they're on their way over to Israel in chapter 14. And they encounter all those nations mentioned in verses 5 through 7. And they plunder all these nations. They take everything these nations have. They defeat these giants that are mentioned, the Emims and whatever in other places in Scripture. And so they're on their way to the Dead Sea, these four nations are. Now then, we're going to get them to the Dead Sea. We see the Plains nations in verses 8 and 9. And this will all hopefully make sense to you when we get to the end of this. Look at verse 8. Now, they have fought these nations in between the east and the west. Verse 8. Now they've got all the way over to the Dead Sea. And there went out the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah, archaeologists believe that those twin cities were right around the Dead Sea. It's also called the Salt Sea. Okay? They found evidence. In that area, by the way, there's a lot of bitumen, which is a very... what do you call a product that sets on fire, like tar? I'm looking for a word. But in that area, there's some slime pits we'll talk about, and there's some where this bitumen is, and it's very flammable. Okay? Keep that in mind. Verse 8. And there went out the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, around the Dead Sea, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, those mentioned before in verse 1, and the king of Bela, the same as Zoar, and they joined battle with them in the valley of Siddim. Now look up here. You've got 4 kings of the east coming over to Israel to do battle with 5 kings of the west. And it's around the Dead Sea. Okay, that's what you have in verse 9. We find out how many nations are in this battle in verse 9. With Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, or king of Persia, or modern-day Iran, and with Tidal, king of nations, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, Iraq, and Ariok, king of Eleazar, 4 kings with 5. 4 kings of the east are going to fight 5 kings of the west. Are we all on the same page here? Okay, now let's find out what happens when this war starts out. It's going to be fought in the Dead Sea area where these slime pits are and where the land is flat. So we've looked at the commotions of war in verses 1 through 9. Now we're looking at the capture of Lot, because Lot has settled down around Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Let's look at verse 10, if you would, please. And the vale, or the valley of Siddim, was full of slime pits. I think it's kind of interesting. You got slime pits and you got homosexuals and slimy people around the slime pits. Isn't that kind of interesting? There'll be slime pits in around Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, moral slime pits as well as literal slime pits. Now watch this. And the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. So these 4 kings of the east are coming over here, and these 5 kings are being overthrown. Sodom and Gomorrah, these twin cities, which were pretty good sized cities, the kings, the leaders of those 2 cities, they flee. They're also called a nation, but again, in a loose sense of the word. And the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountain. In other words, the 4 kings, look at me now, the 4 kings of the east comes over to Israel to fight the 5 kings, and when they do, they all scatter. And the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, they run as well, but they're killed. They fell. Okay? So the leaders of Sodom and Gomorrah, the kings, actually die there, while the other 3 nations flee into the mountains. Now, God is not concerned about the other 3 nations. He's really not concerned about Sodom and Gomorrah. He's concerned about a man by the name of Lot and his family. That's why the Holy Spirit only mentions them. Because there were other people living in Sodom and Gomorrah besides Lot and his family. Why aren't they mentioned? Because God doesn't see them as important because they're unbelievers. We got to recognize God is concerned in the Bible about believers. He'll reveal unbelievers, but the focus, the emphasis, God is concerned about believers. So keep that in mind. Now the capture of Lot, in verse 10, you have the kings die. You have the cities being plundered. Look at verse 11. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their victuals, and went their way. So when Lot is captured, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah die, the cities, the plundering of the 5 nations totaled, they're all plundered, and the goods are taken. Not only the goods, but they capture some of the people of these 5 cities or 5 nations. Look at verse 12. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, which dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. So if you can get the picture here, here you have the 4 kings of the east coming over here to the Dead Sea, which is right around Jerusalem. Brother Ron will be there next week. He's leaving, when are you leaving, Tuesday? Yeah. He'll be there to tell us more about this in detail when he gets back. But that's where we're talking about this battle ensued. And so Sodom and Gomorrah, the leaders are dead. The 4 kings that came over, they've taken all the goods of these 5 nations, and they've taken Lot and his family. That is who God is concerned about. Now, what is Abram going to do about it? Now, think about this for a moment. Back there when Abram said to Lot, Lot, we're going to have to do something here, and I'm going to give you first choice of where you want to go. You can stay here with me around Hebron, or you can have this and I'll go somewhere else. You look around, take your pick. And Lot chooses the valley, the plain area of Sodom and Gomorrah and around the Dead Sea. Y'all still with me? Now then, Lot's been kidnapped and his family. Someone comes and tells Abram, your nephew and his family's been kidnapped, Sodom and Gomorrah, the kings are dead. What are you going to do about it? Now, let's talk first of all, what do you think Abram could have said at this point and been justified in saying it? Does he have to do anything? What could he do, and what do some people do when someone leaves them, bails out on them, or leaves them hanging? What's the normal response of a lot of people when that happens?
Got what they deserve.
Got what they deserve.
I don't want him going with me anymore.
Yeah. Made his bed, he can sleep in it. He knew that there was evil men down in Sodom and Gomorrah, but no, he went on down there. I'm going to let him go. I'm not going to do anything about it. Why should I do anything about it? What do I owe Lot? Go ahead.
Why did they pick Lot for anyway? Why couldn't they pick somebody else?
Ain't that interesting?
I know you don't love
Yeah. But isn't it interesting that they picked Lot? Is it simply because God wants us to focus on Lot, or is there a purpose that he takes this one believer? And of course, we could say, well, they knew that he was a believer. And so, or had Lot, here's something to think about. Had Lot become so rich and successful that they thought, well, we'll take this rich guy with us? Could that have played into it? He was probably rich down in Sodom. He probably was. Because he could have left Sodom and gone back with Abraham, but he must have been prospering down there, and he was willing to vex his righteous soul. You and I talked about this the other day. He was willing to vex his righteous soul as long as he was making some money. And aren't people like that today? And isn't human nature like that? If people's got money in their pockets, they'll let same-sex marriage take place. They'll let abortion take place. Blah, blah, blah. Okay.
Did they know that Lot was related to Abram?
I don't know. What do you think?
Was Abram well regarded in that?
My answer personally is yes. I think they did. I think they were well regarded. I think they were like who's the guy that Microsoft and Apple, much like those guys would be today. They were well-known individuals, and they may have thought they could somehow get something for taking Lot with them, maybe used as a kidnapping thing to, I don't know. Yeah. Because Abram was not just, and I'm glad you brought that up, Abram was just not an unidentified person. He was well known. I mean, to me, there's no question about that. I mean, the guy had 318 servants. That's a pretty rich fella that can afford 318 servants. And so, yeah, he was. I think it's pretty obvious he was. Somebody else. Mm-hmm.
You know, Lot was in a backslidden condition, and Abraham had to get him out before they destroyed the city.
Yeah, and we'll see that later on, of course. But does Abraham owe him anything?
Well,
he is his brother's keeper, isn't he?
He does, because
it's his brother's boy.
It's kind of like the rapture. Lot had to get out of there.
Right, before God destroyed.
Has to be out before God destroyed.
Right.
There's a lot more than I can explain.
Well, we certainly see here the grace of God demonstrated in Abram, because he didn't have to go down and get him out of that situation, but he does. Lot doesn't deserve it, but that's where the grace of Abram comes in, which is symbolic of the grace of God. We don't deserve heaven either. The devil's kidnapped us, right? And so we could get what God to let us sleep in our, we've made our bed, but because of God's grace, He lets us hear the gospel and get saved, and He takes us out of the clutches of the devil. Go ahead.
Going back to these verses, 12 years, 13, 14.
Yeah.
Well, with your governments, Israel will be set up as a government, as a nation.
Mm-hmm.
The 13th year is rebellion and depravity with the Antichrist coming in.
Right.
14th year with Abraham going and delivering Lot is salvation.
Good point. Good point. Of Christ setting up His kingdom.
Right.
When He returns. Good point.
Pattern then is what is going to happen then.
Yeah. That's what makes the Bible so interesting when you start getting into some of this stuff, and you're looking at me like I don't quite get what he's talking about, but you see him afterwards, because you'll find there is patterns in the Bible that yet are to be revealed in the last days. It's just amazing. It's such an amazing book. Well, I want to finish it up. I've got about 2 minutes, so let me finish this up if I can. Notice what happens here in the confederacy of Abram in verse, and I'm going to go through this very quickly. They took Lot, verse 12. There came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew. First time the word Hebrew is mentioned. It probably comes from one of the grandsons of Shem. His name was Ebar, and that's probably where the word Hebrew comes from. For he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, Abram did, around the Dead Sea, brother of Eshcol. Notice these were confederate with Abram. So you've got these nations that are allies, are confederate with Abram. Now Abram's going to recapture Lot. Y'all stay with me. Look at verse 14. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken, he armed his trained servants, which implies Abram's servants were not only servants, but they were soldiers. He had trained them. Why? Because he anticipated problems in advance. It was a wise thing to do. Born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan, which means, everybody look up here. You've got Abram and his 318 servants, plus you've got those that were in confederate with him, his allies, going down to fight these four kings of the east. All right? So keep that in mind. Notice what happens. Verse 15, we see his strategy. He divided himself, Abram did. He was a military strategist as well as a businessman. Against them, against the four kings of the east, he and his servants by night. Notice they do it by night, which is again, military strategy. And smote them and pursued them into Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. So what we see here is the victory of Abraham over these four great nations of the east. And verse 16, here we see the victory that he gets, and he brought back, notice this, what does he bring back? What does he get from these four kings of the east? Number one, he brought back all the goods. That means everything they had acquired, the four kings from the five nations, he got it back. How great a man is this? Not some of the goods, he says all the goods. Now watch this. And also brought again his brother Lot, probably his family as well, we know it would be, and his goods. So Lot is brought back. Abram has done such a wonderful job of recapturing or overthrowing these four kings, Chedorlaomer, and these four nations, that he gets Lot back, all of his goods. Watch this. And the women also, and the people. So the point that you get here, let's go back to is that as these four kings come over here to overthrow the five kings, Lot is captured, and Abram comes to the rescue and defeats these four kings and gets back everything that belongs to the five kings and the nation, including Lot and his family. That's the teaching. In one sense, I'm glad to be through with it, because there's so much. That was hard teaching this morning to try to make it understandable and relevant to everybody here. Basically, what you can get out of this is God is showing. Look, Abram didn't run down to Egypt this time. He didn't bail out this time. Remember when he got in trouble before, what he did? There was a famine, and so he goes down to Egypt. He has grown in grace, Abram has, and he's learned with God's help he can do anything. The interesting thing is, Abram and his 318 servants, if that's all there was, I think there were some allies from the other nations too, were greatly outnumbered. These four kings had a lot. They had a big army. They had four armies. There were a great multitude, and here Abram goes in there with his 318 servants, and maybe a few others, and the odds are incredible. The odds are against Israel. But is that anything new? Gideon's 300. The odds. Matter of fact, God said, you've got too many. Get rid of a few of them, because we can't go in there and do this with 22. What was it? 22,000. It started, and he cut them all down. Finally got down to 300. Now, okay. Now, what I'm saying is, isn't it amazing that today Israel is surrounded by 300 million people that hate them, and Israel only has 7 million in Israel proper, 7 million against 300 million that are all around them. So even today they're greatly outnumbered, but these 300 million people that surround them are scared to death of this little nation Israel, which has the best air force in the world. The war's in there too. It's not as big, but they've got something called, Ron, what is that called? The Iron Dome. Iron Dome that they've been launching, Hamas has been launching these missiles in there, and because they have this system called the Iron Dome, they've shot a lot of them out of the air. I don't know if they got them all or not, but if we knew the sophistication of Israel's Air Force and their army, we would be. They've got stuff, folks, that we don't have in America. Matter of fact, a lot of stuff we have came from the brilliant minds of the Jews in Israel. Hey, they're God's people, and they may be outnumbered, but the God factor determined the outcome. Abram got the victory because he had God on his side, and Chedorlaomer, which is a type of the devil, didn't have God on his side, so he lost that battle. Any questions about anything we taught this morning?